crafty people! Today's video I'm sharing with you how you can do some simple embroidery alphabet letters like this, which I'm using to put on my kids' pencil cases. I'm teaching you just two simple embroidery stitches today, one being the satin stitch and one is a chain stitch, and that is all you'll need to know in order to make some alphabet letters like this. I'll put here on screen some of the other examples that I have done before as well. This I here is going to be on Isabel's pencil case, and I'll also be making an E for Elijah's pencil case, and next week I'll be sharing with you the process of how I actually sew them into pencil cases. So I'd love for you to subscribe to come back and watch that video. But let's head over to the sewing table and I'll show you everything you need in order to make these embroidered alphabet letters. You're going to need a fabric to embroider onto. I have this quilter's cotton here which has planets on it, which is what Elijah has picked for his pencil case. So this is what I'll be embroidering on. You can just choose any fabric you like, probably choose something that is woven, meaning not stretchy. You'll need an embroidery hoop like this. It comes with two parts to it. One is just a wooden circle that has just nothing else on it, and the other one has this little clasp bit at the top which tightens and loosens it when you turn this metal part here. You're also going to need some embroidery floss. It looks like this, and it has 6 strands here, and you're going to use all of them together like this. You'll also need an embroidery needle which looks like this. It's just like a normal hand sewing needle, although it does need to have a big enough eye that you can thread all 6 strands through your needle. I also have a little pair of scissors here. You can get any size of scissors, you just need something to snip your threads with. And I have a zip here because I'll be using that for the pencil case later, but I'll set that aside because today is just about the embroidery. The last thing you're going to need is a template so that you can trace out the letters you want to put onto your embroidery. You could hand draw them if that's something that you're good at, but I have downloaded these ones from Sublime Stitching. They're the Skinny Letter 1 theme embroidery pattern. I'll put a link in the description box. It was just a $5 download so that you could download the alphabet in these skinny letters that I'm using today. So if you'd like to download the exact same ones as me, they'll be in the description box. The reason that mine is cut off a bit like this and it doesn't have the whole alphabet is because I wanted to enlarge mine a little bit. Mine is at 150% of the original document size, so they are slightly larger than what the document originally had. Once you have printed that and gathered all of your resources, the next thing we're going to do is to transfer our letter onto our fabric. And there are various ways that people choose to do this. The way I like to do it is by using my phone as a light source and then tracing it underneath my fabric. So I'm going to move you closer and show you how I do that. So I have my fabric here and I've decided that I want to have my E on this planet here. I'm going to be using this red embroidery floss so it stands out against this sort of yellowy type of planet. So because I want to trace this here, I'm going to start by getting out my phone and I'm going to open up a torch app that has it on the screen. So not a torch that comes out of your camera flash, but you want to have a torch that comes to brighten up your screen. We're going to put this underneath where we want our embroidery to go, and then we're going to also place our letter on top of our phone screen so that when we put our fabric over the top we can then see the letter through the fabric. Place the letter where you want your embroidery to be and trace it out, preferably with something that is going to be water erasable. If I'm tracing out something that is bigger than my phone screen, my table is made out of glass, so I just put a lamp underneath my table and trace out using my glass tabletop as a light source, and then put my paper on top and my fabric on top of that. Or you could use a window as a light source with, you know, putting your fabric and your paper on the window so that you can use the light coming from the sun behind it so that you can trace it like that. Now that we have our letter traced out, we're going to get our embroidery hoop and put that on to hold our fabric tight before we start stitching. To use your embroidery hoop, we're going to separate the two pieces and first start with the backing piece and put our fabric on top of it so that where we have our embroidery is roughly in the center of our embroidery hoop. Then we're going to take the top piece and put it down on top, and then using the little knob on the top to tighten it so that it holds firmly against the fabric. Once our embroidery hoop is on, it holds our fabric nice and taut so that we're able to stitch without the fabric moving or it being sort of floppy and flimsy like this. It's going to make it nice and easy to stitch with. So now I'm going to show you how I choose how long to make my thread and how to thread your needle. When you're hand sewing, you need to keep in mind that you are going to have to pull your thread from your fabric here up like this. And you don't want your thread to be so long that you have to pull your arm so far back and be uncomfortable. So you want your thread to be as long as about this far. So like from your hand to your elbow length. That's the way I like to measure how long I want my thread to be. So I'm going to take the end of my embroidery floss and hold it in my hand and go down around my elbow and back up. Around my elbow and back up again, and that is how long I want my embroidery floss to be. So I'm going to cut it there. And now that I have my length of embroidery floss here, I'm going to thread my needle. So the way I like to do that is to fold the floss over the needle here, pulling it tight so that I can pinch it into a really tight point at the top, and then I can slide it through the eye of the needle. So we're going to pull it through so that I have a tail here, like a shorter side, and then a longer side. I'm going to double knot the longer side so that once I put it through my fabric, it won't unravel and come out. So here's our thread all ready to go. We have a knot in the longer of the sides, and then the shorter side is our tail, and it's all threaded onto our embroidery needle. So let's head over to the table and I'll show you first how to do a satin stitch. So the satin stitch is what I've used to do the stick part here of the eye. It's just going up through one side and then over and down through the other side, and then you just repeat that over and over again, doing these long stitches. I'm going to start with my needle at the back of my fabric, and I'm going to poke up at the very bottom corner of where I want my satin stitches to start. When I pull my needle through, the knot that we've placed on the back just sits like this. Then I'm going to sew a stitch slightly over where my line is so that it does cover that line. You want to make sure you're being consistent with where each of your stitches are going so that they are the same length each time. So there is one stitch just there, and now I'm going to do the same thing. So this time I'm going to go up again on the left, just directly above where my previous stitch was, maybe one or two little strands of the backing fabric apart, and then again right above on the right, doing a stitch and pulling through. So we're just going to keep doing that exact same thing, going up on the left and down on the right. If you're left-handed, you might want to do the opposite. The satin stitch is really easy because it's just doing these long stitches over and over again, and it does fill up your letter nicely so that you've got a big block of colour there. You do want to make sure your stitches are neat and about the same length across. You want to make sure that they're parallel to each other so that they're not getting wonky. It is easier just to work from the front of your fabric, so I do like to just poke my needle in on one side and then angle it up so that it comes out where you want your stitch to go, and then pull, and that way you only have to work from the front of your fabric and you don't have to keep moving your hand underneath as well. But you want to make sure that you're pretty confident with how you're lining it up and how far apart each of your stitches are. Unfortunately, mine is a little bit wonky because doing it on camera is a little harder than when you're able to sort of have it right in front of you focusing, but you get the idea. And you also want to make sure that the tension on each stitch is about the same. So if you pull it too tightly here, if you keep pulling it too tightly, then your stitches are going to draw the fabric in, and if you have it too loose, that stitch is going to look floppy. Also, if your thread is looking a little twisted, see how it's twisting onto my needle here? You can just turn your work upside down and let the needle go, and it will untwist the thread, which will make it easier for you to sew without it sort of looping over on itself, just to keep your thread nice and flat. So that looks like it'll do it there for my satin stitch here. So I'm going to poke my needle through to the back. So my thread is getting really quite short here, so I am going to just knot it off. I'm just going to rethread my needle so I can tie it off. So to knot off my threads, I am picking up a stitch at the back and just forming a knot by poking my needle through that and just pulling it. Remembering to not pull too tight because you don't want to tighten that stitch on the front of your work. And I'll just make a double knot. So again, I'm going through my knot there and putting my needle through the loop that is created and pulling. Remembering to not pull your stitching. I'm going to cut off the tail of our thread here, and I will thread a new piece of embroidery floss and show you how to do our chain stitch next. To start our chain stitch, I've got my thread coming out of my fabric just here, and I'm going to poke my needle back exactly through the same hole that it is just coming out and pulling it down so that it creates a loop. So it should look like this once we have done that first part of the stitch there. So now that I have my loop there, I'm now putting my needle up where I want the length of my first stitch to be. So I want it to be about that long, about just under 1/2 centimetre there. And I need to put my needle up through my fabric, but also through that initial loop that I did, so that it is catching that loop of fabric, that loop of the thread. And then when I pull it, it will create a chain like this. So I'm going to take my needle and go in through where my needle is coming out and tilt it up so that it is a stitch length away. I'm going to make sure that my needle is coming out through my loop of my thread, so that when I pull it, it creates a bit of a chain like this. I'll show you a few more. Repeat that same thing across the whole top of your letter, and then for me doing the E, I'm going to do that again in the middle and the very bottom of my letter as well. Once you get to the end of your row here like this, I'm going to put my needle through on the outside of my chain stitch and pull it through to the back to complete that row of stitching. I've done this middle part of my E now, and I'm going to have to travel down to the bottom of my E. So I'm going to thread my needle all the way through the back of these stitches, just so that it is hiding where I'm running that stitch there, so that I now have my thread coming out at the bottom here, which means that I won't have like a diagonal thread going across the back, because sometimes you can see that on the front of your fabric. If you download the same letters that I am using, you could use these 2 stitches on any of the letters in the alphabet. The long thin sticks like what I've got here that I'm doing right now, you could just use the chain stitch for, and the thicker part of the letter you could use your satin stitch. Any of the letters in this kit, in this set, would work perfectly fine using just these 2 stitches. The other thing to keep in mind is that you want to have the same amount of stitches along the top and bottom here, so you can count the stitches on top and try and match on the bottom, so that it looks even and you're keeping the width of each of your stitches the same. So again, I've reached my last stitch of this row, so I'm poking my needle outside of my chain stitch there so that it closes off that loop there, pulling it through to the back. I'm able to tie my thread off here and chop off the excess, and then I'll be able to take off the embroidery hoop and it will be completed. Once you've finished with your embroidery hoop, you just need to turn the top the opposite way than when we tightened it. Wow, I did that one tight. Okay, there we go. Which will release the wooden hoop so you can pop them off. And then you'll probably want to give your work a bit of an iron to get rid of any of the marks that that hoop left. So here is what they look like now. There is the E we've just done and the I as well. And I'll show you on the screen here some of the embroidery I did on previous pencil cases I made for 2 friends of our kids. You will have noticed that I embroidered on my fabric before I cut out the pieces I needed to make my pencil cases. And that's because I wanted my embroidery to be right in the corner of the pencil case. So once I've cut it out, it would be too much of a tight squeeze there to put in my embroidery hoop. So it's easier to put your big piece of fabric into your embroidery hoop and do the embroidery first, and then cut the pattern pieces out around your embroidery. So there you have it. I hope you enjoyed learning how to do both the chain stitch and the satin stitch in order to sew these alphabet letters. If you have a go at doing some embroidery like this, I'd love to see a picture of it. You can tag me on Instagram at mymum.marie. And as always, I'd love for you to subscribe to this channel so that you can come back and see some of my future projects, including when I change these pieces of fabric here into the pencil cases for the kids. Thanks so much for watching this video, and until next time, go get creative, and I'll see you later.